the rise and fall of empires. The Bible told you so. And we're going to be looking at this topic with respect to Daniel chapter 2, which of course was our opening reading. Daniel chapter 2 can be summarised as the world's history in a dream. And we will see this when we compare world history to Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So Nebuchadnezzar, an Assyrian, was the king of Babylon, one of the earliest empires which could truly be called a world empire, influencing all the nations of the then known world. Now, while Babylon was founded more than 4,000 years ago, it was during the period from about 326 BC that the Second Babylonian Empire, otherwise known as the Neo-Babylonian Empire, expanded greatly with unmatched economic and population growth, including massive building projects. Some interesting facts about Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar's father ruled from about 626 BC. Nebuchadnezzar was placed at the head of his father's armies in 609 BC. Nebuchadnezzar took Palestine away from the control of Egypt in 606 BC. And Nebuchadnezzar took some Jewish captives to Babylon in 606 BC. Among them was Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar became the joint ruler with his father in 606 BC, and finally he became the sole ruler of Babylon in 604 BC. And it was during 606 BC that King Nebuchadnezzar seized the land of Israel, and many of the Jewish people who lived there were taken away into the city of Babylon as captives. And among these was Daniel, who was about 17 years old. And Daniel was taken from Jerusalem and placed among the elite group of Jewish captives whom Nebuchadnezzar had appointed to be educated in the wisdom and culture of Babylon. In the second chapter of Daniel, we read of a remarkable incident. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream which impressed and disturbed him greatly. He saw a great image of a man whose head was of gold, his breast and arms of silver, his belly and thighs of brass, his legs of iron, and his feet part of iron and part of clay. He then saw a stone smite or smash the image on its feet with such force that it fell and was broken to pieces. And the stone grew and became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. The dream was so vivid and the figure so bright and terrible that Nebuchadnezzar felt compelled to find out what it all meant. So Nebuchadnezzar called his wise men, the magicians, astrologers, and sorcerers, to tell him the meaning. But to prove that they really knew the meaning, he also told them to tell him what he had dreamt. None of the wise men of Babylon were able to relate the dream to the king, and consequently could not give the meaning of it. When news of this reached Daniel, who was still a teenager, now 19 years old, he appealed to God and was given understanding by God to not only tell the king what he had dreamt, but also to unlock the mystery of what was to happen in the latter days. Daniel, with confidence in God, was brought in and appeared before the king to interpret the king's dream. And Daniel chapter 2, verses 27 to 28 says, Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, The secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers, show unto the king. But there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. The image dream. Daniel proceeded to accurately describe the dream and the interpretation as God had revealed it to him about the great image of a man whose head was of gold, his breast and arms of silver, his belly and thighs of brass, his legs of iron and his feet part of iron and part of clay. The meaning. The dream was in fact a prophecy foretelling future events. And it is astounding to look back into history and to see the great accuracy of this prophetic message. We are able to see that it has been fulfilled in part, and it is still being fulfilled today. The subject matter concerns the events which have taken place over the last 2,600 years. It reveals that from the time of the Babylonian Empire, there would be 4 great empires which would dominate the then known world, and show also that there would be a final end to the rule of man. You will see from an examination of Daniel chapter 2 that each of the metals which composed the image represented a particular world power. And we're able to interpret these in conjunction with the words of Daniel and world history. The head of gold, the first Gentile kingdom, Babylon. When Daniel came before Nebuchadnezzar to relate the content and meaning of the king's dream, he indicated the image portrayed the progression of 4 kingdoms. In the interpretation, Daniel began with the head of gold at the top of the image and moved downward to the feet. This downward movement represented the passage of time. Thus, the upper parts of the image portrayed earlier history, and the lower parts represented later history. In interpreting the head of gold, Daniel said to Nebuchadnezzar, "Thou art this head of gold, and after thee shall arise another kingdom." Therefore, the head of gold represented both King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian kingdom. This kingdom had great dominion over the inhabited earth, and archaeology has since shown how rich this kingdom was. God chose gold to represent Babylon for 2 reasons. First, Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, was called the god of gold. Second, Babylon used gold extensively in its buildings, images, and shrines. Herodotus, the famous Greek historian who visited Babylon 90 years after the era of Nebuchadnezzar, was astonished at the amount of gold there. Even walls and buildings were overlaid with gold. It is evident then that Babylon was the first great kingdom in this portrayal of the times of the Gentiles. Breast and arms of silver, the second Gentile kingdom, Medo-Persia. After interpreting the head of gold of the image of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Daniel stated that another kingdom would come after Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. And historically, Babylon was succeeded by Medo-Persia. God's prophetic portrayal of the second Gentile kingdom as two arms coming together to form one breast on the image was descriptive of the two distinct peoples, the Medes and the Persians, who were united together in 550 BC under the same king to form one great power. In 538 BC, Darius the Mede and Cyrus the Persian joined forces and conquered the city of Babylon, setting up in its place the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medo-Persians, led by King Cyrus, invaded Babylonia from the east in June of 538 BC and captured its capital, Babylon, in July of the same year. The breast and arms of silver were a fitting representation of the Medo-Persian kingdom, because in ancient times silver was used as money and was the standard value and medium of exchange. Medo-Persia became noted for basing its power on money, which was collected through an extensive tax system. Daniel stated that Medo-Persia would be inferior to Babylon, but it was not inferior in military strength, for it conquered Babylon, nor was it inferior in size, for Medo-Persia became a much larger kingdom than Babylon. But it was inferior in one respect, because it was a partnership kingdom. It lacked the absolute unity that Babylon enjoyed. Belly and thighs of brass, the third Gentile kingdom, Grecian Empire. Medo-Persia was eventually conquered by Alexander the Great in 334 BC. The conquests of Alexander the Great were to finally overthrow the Medo-Persian Empire and to establish the Grecian Empire in about 331 BC. This dominion extended over the territories stretching from Greece all the way to India. Alexander the Great was a military genius whose ability on the field of battle was unrivaled in his day, and whose military tactics are recognised and studied by strategists to this day. He extended his rule much further than any previous conqueror. He overthrew and occupied Medo-Persia and invaded India, though subsequently he withdrew his forces to the Indus River and made that the most easterly part of his borders. According to legend, the young man Alexander wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. He died at the age of 33, and after his death, the territory over which Alexander ruled was divided amongst his top 4 generals. The legs of iron brass, the fourth Gentile kingdom, the Roman Empire. The Roman legions conquered the 4 divisions of the Grecian Empire, extending the territory west to the Atlantic. The iron-like power of Rome steadily extended its own influence over the world and replaced the Grecian Empire. the Roman Empire was the strongest of the powers represented by the image and lasted the longest time. The Roman Empire was eventually broken up and divided into two parts, a Western division and an Eastern division, the two legs of the image. This was due to various invaders from the north and east, such as the Vandals, the Goths, and the Huns. The West was ruled from Rome until 476 AD, and the East from Constantinople until 1453 AD, when it finally fell to the Turks. And finally, the feet part of iron and part of clay. It's the fifth stage of the image, divided Europe. Since the Roman Empire, there has never been since one power to unite all the territories of the previous world empires and enjoyed such dominant control of the known world. Search the history books and you will discover that though there have been many attempts to achieve world domination, for example, Napoleon in the 19th century and Hitler in the 20th century, these have all failed. The result of this has been a situation in the earth of a mixture of strong nations, the iron, and weaker nations, the clay. And as iron and clay do not mix, so these powers will not be joined together. The stone, the final stage of the image, Jesus Christ and the kingdom of God. Daniel chapter 2 verse 34 states, "Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon its feet, that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces." This stone power and its work is clearly interpreted in Daniel chapter 2 verse 44, with the God of heaven to set up a kingdom. "In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom, which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever." We are living today in the feet stage of the image vision. Just as all the stages of the prophecy have come true, so also we can expect the destruction of the image by the stone. The Bible reveals who the stone is. Jesus Christ, in Matthew chapter 21, verses 42 to 44, quoting the Old Testament and talking about himself, said, "Did ye never read in the scriptures, the stone which the builders rejected, the same is become the head of the corner? And whosoever shall fall on this stone shall be broken. But on whomsoever it shall fall, it shall grind him to powder. Jesus Christ is the stone. As Christadelphians, we believe the final stage of the image will come to pass, just as Daniel informed the king in Daniel chapter 2, verse 45. "For as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter, and the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure." So we can have confidence that at the set time, God will set up a kingdom. His kingdom shall never be destroyed. unlike the Babylonian Empire, Medo-Persian Empire, the Grecian Empire, the Roman Empire, and divided Europe. The rulership of this kingdom will not be left in the hands of men. Jesus Christ, with those faithful followers who have been made immortal at his return, will rule over it. God's kingdom, with Jesus Christ as King, will destroy all other political systems, and God's kingdom shall stand forever. So in conclusion, the prophet Daniel was given several visions that reveal the history of the world from 606 BC through to the establishment of the kingdom of God on earth. The prophecy of Daniel chapter 2, made long before the time of Jesus Christ, has been fulfilled in all but the final stages. And because of this, we can have confidence that the final outcome will be as described by Daniel, the establishment of the kingdom of God on earth. We therefore wait for the time when the sure words of prophecy will be fulfilled, and Jesus will return to the earth to sit upon God's throne in Jerusalem, ruling the nations of the earth. While we wait, it would be wise to find out more about God's purpose. If we do this, we will discover that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him.